Welcome, Erik, to the Natural Justice Podcast. Today we will be talking about oceans and governance from a legal perspective. To start, could you walk us through what has made you an expert in this field? Basically, how did you go from being a first-year law student in the Netherlands to now working as an expert in international fisheries working in Australia?
Yeah, thanks very much, Eva. It's nice to be here. It's an honor to appear on your podcast. So I started studying actually in the Netherlands with an undergrad in international relations. And at the city where I studied, there was also the possibility to do an undergrad in international law and European law. And back then I thought that was a little bit more specific than the undergrad in international relations. So I did that one as well. And it sounds a little bit strange for a lawyer maybe, but I especially like the field where there's not that much law yet.
Mm-hmm.
So in domestic systems, we have a lot of laws, a lot of regulations. So do we in the European Union, for example, but it's a little less so in international law. So there's not the whole lot of other things that play a role in international law. Although on land, we still have quite a lot of laws. As soon as you go out on the ocean, it's even less. So I thought, I'm not sure if that's correct, and I'm sure that other people will have other opinions about it. But going into the law of the sea, there's a lot of creativity still needed because you need to devise laws and regulations on the basis of not that many principles, not that many things. And this was really attractive. And especially I did my master's in public international law, and there was also a heavy component on the law of the sea. Even then I thought it was not enough, so I did a master's specifically in law of the sea. And it's also very interesting to deal with the environment because the environment is legally so different. I remember a fellow student of mine saying back then in my undergrad, it's really interesting to deal with the environment because the environment often has a negative value instead of a positive value. And that is something that always stuck with me. And maybe we get to talk later on also a little bit about why that might not be the case, actually. So that's a little bit my path. And then for the studying, then I had the opportunity straight after my master's to work at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. They had their biggest case up till then, a maritime delimitation case between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And I was lucky enough to be there at that point in time. I was lowest in rank. Running around with documents, but it was a lot of fun.
Still fun.
And you got to know a little bit how law of the sea is made, how the people were really there when it developed, and that was really interesting. And then I got the opportunity to do to pursue a PhD in the north of Germany at Kiel University. Stayed there for a long time. Worked a lot with natural scientists because I really believe in the fact that interdisciplinary work is important in ocean affairs. And then at some point I thought, well, what else can we do? And then a colleague of mine whom I had known for a very long time sent me the advertisement for the job that I have now. So now I'm a lecturer at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, a very long name, but it nicely abbreviates as ANCORS. At the University of Wollongong, which is about an hour south of Sydney.
Excellent. Yeah, and I really like what you said about kind of the ability to be a bit more creative when there's less law. And I find this as well with international law. Law in general, I love kind of seeing how far you can push things. That's why for me, people are like, oh, law, isn't that so boring? And I'm like, no, it's like a little puzzle. And, depending on what you're trying to push for, you can just bring everything together. But what I also like is that you do always have to consider all of the different sides and the different interests. So it becomes a lot more, I guess, nuanced naturally in the way that it is, because it's just kind of built in that you're always kind of navigating these different interests and balancing that. And also because of this, for my work, European law, for instance, is very important. But I find European law very complicated to work with because it's almost like over-codified. And what's tricky then I find sometimes with it's like over-codified in some areas, but then other areas where it's like, oh, how would it interact with this? Then they're sometimes missing it. And with, I think, international law, yeah, you are talking about more generally, you just by the nature of the law, it's not going to go into all of those details because that's ultimately up to the states themselves to do the work there and use their national laws to further fill that in. I agree with you, a very rewarding area of law to work in, and one where we need to still really develop a lot of these principles and concepts. Okay, now how does that apply in the current reality that we have, which is something we will be talking a lot more about in our conversation. So I'd like to dive into that now that we have established that you will definitely know what you're talking about when it comes to law of the sea, and have even worked at the International Tribunal. Which, yeah, even if I have to make copies, I would be happy to just take a job there. So we will be delving first into one principle in law of the sea specifically, which is something we reference as the common heritage of mankind, which means that in certain areas, the resources like the deep ocean floor beyond national jurisdictions, for instance, that they are managed for the benefit of all humanity rather than appropriated by the individual states. You've completed a PhD where you dived into this principle, which is part of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, which is sort of a constitution for the law of the sea. And under UNCLOS, this is a recognized principle, the common heritage of mankind, but it does only apply to the mineral resources of the seabed and never really to any living marine resources like fish. But you actually did dive into this principle and explored how, we manage fisheries and how this principle could maybe benefit the way that we manage fisheries. So instead of giving out fishing rights to individual states or companies as it is done now, you looked at what could happen if we treated the exploitation or protection of certain marine resources, I think in your case then for the Atlantic bluefin tuna, as belonging to everyone, where there isn't so much an individual right of the state to manage it, but we're talking about something that we reference as community rights, a shared right. So could you, before we dive into the legal details, could you give us some context of why you think it could be valuable to consider using this principle, even though that's not how it's dictated in UCLOS now, using this principle to manage certain fish as a shared community resource rather than the competition of the individual rights of the states as we offer now?
Yeah, it started out a little bit as it was curiosity driven. It sounds really
Hmm.
cliche, but it was like that. So I went to I had heard a lot about fisheries. I did an internship at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and worked with a lady who was very influential in a lot of fisheries laws, did a lot of projects for the World Bank and so on and so on. And then later on, during my other masters, we talked a lot about with fisheries managers. And what I had I came I kind of figured out that a lot of these fisheries management issues come down to property rights, and it's
Hmm.
getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So first we have a total allowable catch for example, a certain country. And then we limit that to a certain fisheries community. We might limit it to a vessel that then can catch so much. We might then to a to fisher folk who actually get a certain quota. So it's really narrow, narrow, narrow. And then I heard a lecture about the common heritage, actually by your PhD supervisor, Eva. It's a small world. We don't have to, I don't
Yeah, I love to see that.
pretend that it's not.
Yeah.
And then it made me think, and I was like, well, just out of curiosity and also being a bit stubborn, I know that the common heritage is not applicable to marine living resources, but what if?
Yeah,
What if
exactly.
we look at it from the other side of the spectrum? So now we're
Hmm.
getting smaller and smaller and smaller into almost property rights, right? Which I think actually is the wrong way of saying it, because nobody has ever a property right over a certain fish stock. You have a user right, but as soon as this is an individual user right, so you are allowed to catch so much, it's very hard to distinguish between an individual user right and an individual property right in practice. So that development, I kind of wanted to counter it from an academic perspective and then say, okay, let's go to the other side of the spectrum. Let's say this fish doesn't belong to so and so and so, but it belongs to everybody. What then do we need to change in the regulation of international fisheries? So that's a little bit how it came about. And then since that had just happened a month before the deadline, I could apply for that PhD position. I thought, hey, that might be
Just in
interesting.
time.
Yes, and I stuck with that. Yeah, that's how it all started. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess it was kind of, yeah, what if we just kind of rethink and kind of flip this thinking around? Would that then allow us to address some of the challenges we have in fisheries. And I think what you said, yeah, kind of like the difference between property rights and user rights, it reminds me of my own research, which is very much related to fisheries data and transparency. And you do find that if you go down to the national level, that there are some jurisdictions that do consider the fish in their EEZ to be belonging to the public. And in that sense, that there is an obligation upon the state to publish certain fisheries data because the people have the right to know what is happening to the natural resources because it belongs to the common good. So I guess this would almost be taking that way of thinking and taking that at the international level, because in the international law of the sea, that is very much not how it is organized right now. We also see that, these jurisdictions, I'm really talking about a handful here, where there's on the other side much more jurisdictions that would rather say like, no, fishing companies have a right to privacy of their information, and wherever they're fishing, that's their, trade secrecy, etc. I think that would be, if you then, take the international law and distill it down to a lot of these states, it would be quite a radical change. And yeah, very interesting to see. I love doing those tests as well, even if it's just a bit of philosophy. But I think it's always good to just break away from, or at least dare to break away from the way we think now and question why do we do it like this? And are we just, in trying to address some of these issues, is it just really kind of band-aids for something that is so fundamentally not working that it's never, as we say in Dutch, is it maybe like mopping while we have the tab running? And should we maybe just think about what can we actually do to close that tab, sticking to that example? So, okay, so we know that in principle, the common heritage of mankind principle does only apply to the mineral resources in the seabed beyond national jurisdiction, at least in the context of the sea. In your research, did you ever find out why? Is there any particular reason why common heritage of mankind is limited to the seabed and explicitly not extending to living marine resources? And have you maybe found any elements as well in this where you're like, yeah, I can see how they did that. Maybe it isn't really a perfect fit for living resources.
So the common heritage was initially, the idea was that its application would be much wider than it now is, right? So it was proposed by Arvid Pardo, the Maltese ambassador to the United Nations, 1967. A very long speech, very passionate according to the people who were there.
Yeah, at what kind of platform was this speech? Because I think now at the UN meetings you get cut off after 4 minutes. So
Yes. I think this took hours. So
yeah, interesting.
I think it was in the first committee. Yes. So I think it was in the first committee where he got the chance to talk about this. And this was before we actually were dealing with the Law of the Sea Convention. Before there was the Seabed Committee, right? And this
Yeah.
speech from Pardo actually made, that was the incentive to start a Seabed Committee where we wanted to talk about what we can do with the seabed. But back then, in 67, there was no such thing as the exclusive economic zone, like you mentioned already. And indeed, by the way, this is a side note, but I agree that initially the exclusive economic zone, the idea was much more akin to stewardship, right? So that you give coastal states stewardship over their resources and therefore hope that they will take care of it, because people tend to take care of what they own.
What could benefit them?
Yes, exactly. So that was the idea. But Pardo's speech was before this existed. And back then, we actually did not even know the breadth of the territorial sea. So Pardo's initial proposal was to apply the common heritage to both the water column and the deep seabed beyond the territorial sea, which in many cases back then was only 3 nautical miles from the coast. So he wanted the vast majority of the ocean to be the common heritage of humankind. And that included everything. Of course, the continental shelf regime had already developed, right? So there the coastal state would already have sovereign rights over its natural resources. But beyond that, and in the water column, it's supposed to be the common heritage. And that then was watered down, so to say, or at least according to Pardo and the Maltese delegation, to only be applicable to the deep seabed beyond the continental shelf. And when the negotiations for the Law of the Sea Convention formally started in 1973, actually the content started in 1974, there was not much known about life in that area.
Mhm.
So it was also easy to apply it. What I always find fascinating, by the way, and this is a side note, but the
We love side
Singapore.
notes.
Okay, good. There was a delegate from Singapore, I think it was Mr. Jayakumar, who in 1972 in the Seabed Committee, which was kind of the preparatory commission for the Law of the Sea Convention, the Conference on the Law of the Sea, which then ended up with the Law of the Sea Convention. He said in 1972, without knowing that there was any life in the deep sea, right, in the deep sea beyond the continental shelf, he said, well, we might as well think about what if there is actually life beyond, because if we don't, we're going to be here again in 10 years, 20
Mhm.
years time, negotiating
Yeah.
this all over again. And
Yeah.
this was almost a prophecy, right? Because this actually pointed to, with the benefit of hindsight, to the BB&J negotiations, the biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which is now about to enter into force. So it's fascinating that somebody actually forecasted that already more than half a century ago.
Mhm.
Anyway, long story
And
short,
there's still a lot that we don't know, right? Especially if we're
yes,
talking about
yeah.
the deep sea.
There's this famous saying that we know more about the surface of the moon than about the deep ocean, right?
Yeah,
Now,
exactly.
I'm not a natural scientist, so I cannot assess if that is true or not. But if you talk to natural scientists who go to the deep sea, they will tell you that they will discover a lot of new species. And so there is a lot of unknowns. But I guess it was easy back then to make it only applicable to the things we actually know. And so it was never really applied to marine living resources. Yes, first of all, because we thought they weren't there or we didn't know their existence. In my view, lawyers have a tendency as well. Most of these delegates were lawyers, right? They have a tendency to say, oh, well, just stick with what we know. Let's not go too far out and start regulating stuff where we actually don't know what it's going to be about. And you see that with deep sea mining at the moment, right? That you try
Yeah,
to regulate an
exactly.
activity that does not really happen yet.
Mhm.
And that leads to a lot of difficulties. So I think that conservatism, so to say, played a role there as well. Are there any specific ideas within the common heritage, to come back to your question, that don't allow it to be applicable to the marine living resources? I don't think so. And I
Okay.
think that it actually could work. And that is also, in that sense, I agree with Arvid Pardo and also, for example, Elisabeth Mamborghese, who was instrumental in pushing for that principle. As they initially wanted, it could have applied to the whole ocean, beyond the territorial sea and the continental shelf, and there would be no limitations to it.
Excellent. Well, that's a very clear answer.
It would, of course, do away with the freedom of the seas, right? And this was the initial
Sure.
idea
The
of
initial
Pardo.
thinking. Yeah.
Because they were afraid. Pardo was kind of the lead of a lot of countries who had just become independent from their
Mhm.
former colonizers, including Malta, and become independent of the United Kingdom in 64, so only 3 years before Pardo's speech. And the idea was that they were afraid if the freedom of the seas is applicable to these riches in the deep ocean, then it's obvious the states with the most money who can develop the technology and get there first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Freedom of the seas is, in a nutshell, not much different than first come, first serve, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
the developing states or newly industrializing states would lose out again. And the common heritage, as part of the new international economic order, would actually counter that idea of the newly independent states to lose out again.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that inequality, we do still see that in
Yeah.
the international system,
Yes.
which I think they're trying to address with the BB&J agreement, but of course that's still all waiting for it to enter into force and then what it's actually going to do in practice. So in your research, you didn't say just for any living resources, you specifically looked at Atlantic bluefin tuna. What are some characteristics of this species that you found could make this communal rights approach very suitable?
So the nice thing about highly migratory species,
Which
which are
tuna
covered
is.
in, yes, highly migratory species is the legal term for tuna, so to say, and
Mhm.
tuna-like species. They're covered in the Law of the Sea Convention under the Exclusive Economic Zone part in Article 64. And those characteristics are that they are most of the time they spawn in one exclusive economic zone. For example, the Gulf of Mexico, right? Possibly also the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not up to date with the natural science, but that's my latest information.
Yeah.
And then they cross the ocean, right? So they cross the ocean. In the case of the Atlantic bluefin tuna, up to 90 kilometers an hour. So they're really, really fast. And they cross the whole ocean, as I said. So from exclusive economic zones to the high seas to exclusive economic zones and back, which made it for me a very thankful fish species to cover with the common heritage of humankind because they
Yeah.
cross the whole ocean, right? Of
Yeah.
course, there's other fish species, many fish species that, for example, occur in exclusive economic zones and sometimes swim outside the exclusive economic zones a little bit on the high seas and then come back. Cod would be such a species, for example, if I'm not mistaken. And there's also discrete high sea species, as they call it. So species that only occur on the high seas. That would have been an example as well. But I thought if it's really crossing the whole ocean, and that's specifically the case for tuna, that will be a nice example to focus on, so to say. I could have also talked about highly migratory species in general, but I thought it would be nice to give it one particular species, which actually is known very well. When I started my PhD, there was a lot of discussion. It was very much badly managed when I started doing my research.
Which was when?
So I started thinking about this in 2011 and I
Okay.
started my PhD in 2012. And maybe we get to speak to this later, but it got its 15 minutes of fame, so to say, in 2010 when there was competition, so to say, for the management of Atlantic bluefin tuna, not by its management organization, which had been in charge of it for a long time, more than half a century, but by another organization or another convention, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, abbreviated as CITES. And they threatened to regulate tuna, Atlantic bluefin tuna, by putting it on their endangered species list. It's a little more specific than that, but maybe for now that's sufficient. And so it got this attention. And I wrote my master thesis actually about the Atlantic bluefin tuna under CITES, under this convention, especially because my then lecturer was so enthusiastic. He said, I'm trying to convince people to write their master thesis about this fish for I don't know how long. And he was really championing
Yeah.
it as a very successful environmental treaty, which I think it
Mm-hmm.
is. So I said, okay, I'll do it. And that got me into the whole Atlantic bluefin tuna stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the one other thing that I have to mention to be for the
Mm-hmm.
sake of completeness is that I could, of course, also have it applied to marine mammals, to cetaceans, because whales do the same thing. But the common heritage, in my view, allows for both the protection of a certain species as well as the usage of a certain species. And as soon as you start allowing usage for human consumption or whatever, of marine mammals, to be totally frank, I thought that would create some kind of discussion which would go way beyond my thesis. So I decided to focus on tuna.
Yeah, and also often it can really help for the sake of research to zoom in something so you at least have a clear scope. And it doesn't mean that whatever you're finding in that context that it cannot still apply to a lot of other species as long as you kind of crystallize why this is one of those species that is so suitable for that for this and this reason. And I understand what you're saying because it is basically a type of species that very much shows why this sovereign nation model of fisheries management doesn't always work and why there is whatever doesn't matter if every state in the world does an excellent job at fisheries management, you will always need international collaboration if you really want to safeguard the status of all species. And then the fact that, bluefin tuna is quite a high value species, I'm sure that doesn't really make things easier either. So let's pretend for a moment that we live in a world where there is such a thing as quick political decision making for the good of the environment. And we start using the application of the common heritage of mankind principle to bluefin tuna tomorrow. How do you think that would change the reality of fisheries management?
Yeah, so the thing that you then need to do, I guess, is define what common heritage actually entails. And the Law of the Sea Convention doesn't do that. The Outer Space Treaty or the Moon Treaty, which also include something akin to common heritage, also don't do that. Both these treaties don't. So we're left kind of with the interpretation of the Law of the Sea Convention in Part 11, which deals with deep sea mining, for what the common heritage actually means. And it has been Arvid Pardo in his speech already gave different characteristics of the principle. And the first one back then was peaceful use, because it was also supposed to prevent the United States and the Soviet Union from putting nuclear facilities on the deep ocean floor, right?
Yeah, let's not forget about the political context
Yeah, that
in
was
which
very,
UNCLOS was negotiated.
yeah, the heydays of the Cold War.
Yeah.
That was definitely a component back then as well.
Mm-hmm.
Non-appropriation was the second component, which doesn't distinguish it that much from the freedom of the seas, right? Because in the freedom of the seas, you also have this non-appropriation. But then there's this component of protection of the marine environment as well. Again, not very much different from the freedom of the seas, because you have now laid down in Article 192 of the Law of the Sea Convention, you have this obligation for states to protect and preserve the marine environment. It only starts to become different from the freedom of the seas when we go to the fourth characteristic, which is benefit sharing. So you need to share the benefits, or not all benefits, right? But part of the benefits from whatever you harvest, and not just with the current generations. So not just with everybody who's living now, but also with future generations. So it has a clear intergenerational component as well. And in order to do that, the fifth characteristic is international management. And this international management for deep sea mining is done by the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica. That also then prevents the common heritage with this international management system, prevents unilateral deep sea mining in this case, or unilateral harvesting. And that has been the case for a very long time, right? With deep sea mining, nobody actually said, we're going to do this unilaterally, until the current United States administration decided to announce that a couple of months ago, that they would do that. And now there's a lot of my colleagues who write about the legality of such a thing. But those are the five characteristics. So what we then need to look at when we want to apply it to, for let's say, Atlantic bluefin tuna, where does the benefit sharing come in? Right? So how do we share the benefits of this? And at the same time, make sure that there's enough to harvest for future generations as well, to have these benefits as well. And that is something, because the international management is there. So I alluded to this already before. We have the International Convention on the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, founded by a treaty in Rio de Janeiro in 1966, entered into force a couple of years later. And they are responsible for tuna in the Atlantic Ocean, including Atlantic bluefin tuna. By the way, doing such a bad job that certain environmental NGOs at some point called it the international conspiracy to catch all tuna.
I've read that.
So we have all that. The only thing that you need to do is look at benefit sharing, right? And for me, to have enough tuna in the future to share this benefit, it would mean a heavy reduction or a heavy rebuilding program of the stock, and probably with wider repercussions than just the Atlantic bluefin tuna, but looking at it more from an ecosystem perspective, which is very difficult to do, admittedly. But this is what the UN Fish Stocks Agreement requires, to look at it broader than just a single species. But since ICCAT was negotiated, was started 3 decades before the Fish Stocks Agreement, it kind of needed to catch up, right, later on. And so this was difficult to do. But that benefit sharing, I think that's the crucial point. And if we could decide that now, at least when I finished the thesis in 2019, here it is, then it was already rebuilding. The stock was already on its way up. So during the process of me writing my thesis, which took way too long, by the way, but it was rebuilding. So when I started my thesis, it was down and out. And then during my writing, it actually started rebuilding. I don't, of course, and I'm not completely objective here, I don't want to say that made my thesis superfluous, but it is rebuilding and it's doing better. I mean, it could have been even better, but yeah.
Yeah, no, we do luckily see that with some tuna species. You bring up ICAT, which I wanted to talk to you about a bit more as well, because you do work in this context as well. So ICAT, as you mentioned, is the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. It is RFMO managing the high seas fisheries of several tuna species. Could you briefly explain how you are involved now with ICAT, and if there's maybe a link between everything that we just discussed on bluefin tuna and common heritage of mankind?
Yeah, so I'm not personally involved as in with the work of ICAT. I'm writing about it.
Yeah.
As an academic. It's in that sense, it's a fascinating organization because it's one of the early regional fisheries management organizations, right? One of the
Yeah.
early RFMOs, and normally we distinguish in RFMOs between tuna RFMOs and non-tuna RFMOs. So ICAT is one of the tuna RFMOs, and which I mentioned before already, it's one of those tuna RFMOs that existed already before the fish stocks agreement entered into force. So it had somewhat older provisions in it that might have not been completely up to date.
Could you explain a bit what the fish stocks agreement is exactly? Just
Yes,
for anyone who maybe doesn't have that context.
yes, sure. So as you mentioned already before, Eva, the Law of the Sea Convention is, at least by the last president of its of the conference that negotiated it, Tommy Koh from Singapore. He said it's the constitution of the oceans, right? So
Yeah. The primary
although it's
source.
although it's the largest effort ever in international law, the longest negotiation times, the biggest convention, because it has 320 articles and a whole bunch of annexes to it. It doesn't regulate everything. It's the constitution, right? And in a constitution, not everything is regulated. It's just the basis
And it's
of.
also quite old.
Yes,
For anyone who doesn't know it, it's from 82.
exactly.
So, as we know, the world has changed since then.
Yes, I mean, side example, it was concluded in 1982, so climate change doesn't play a role at all.
Exactly.
It has these articles on straddling stocks, so the ones that occur in more than one exclusive economic zone in Article 63, and then these highly migratory species like tuna in Article 64, but it's not very detailed. In 1995, there was the very long agreement. The title of the agreement is super long, but it's most of the time known as the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement, which deals with these straddling stocks and highly migratory species. This is what they call an implementation agreement. So it's implementing the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention for these species. Also taking into account the high seas articles for marine living resources, so 116 to 119. And what it does, it adds new environmental components that received a lot of attention in 1992 in the big Rio conference, where the Convention on Biological Diversity was negotiated, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and so on. There's a big early 90s, right? Cold War is over. Everybody happy. We're now going to care about the environment.
Super optimistic about the future.
Fukuyama, end of history story. So
Yeah.
this is a bit in a nutshell where you have to put this this idea of the fish stocks agreement as well. So it does require states to work together in regional fisheries management organizations, which the Law of the Sea Convention already did, but it specifies what to do. It includes different principles, including the precautionary approach to fisheries, the ecosystem approaches. So it's a much more detailed set of rules for these stocks. And of course, ICAT then needed to deal with this after the fact, so to say, right? So ex post facto, because they were already existing for 3 decades, and now all of a sudden these new rules came in.
Yeah,
They have
which
done so
then
reluctantly.
a lot of additional RFMOs were created following the fish stock agreement, right? Yeah.
And they could, of course, copy the provisions in the fish stocks agreement. The ICAT didn't have that opportunity. So they have adopted a protocol in 2019, trying to focus more on the long-term conservation of species. So more the protection than the short-term harvesting. But this 2019 protocol has not entered into force yet. So I think in general, the opinion about ICAT would be that it reluctantly starts to update its provisions. For some species, that works way better than others. And for bluefin tuna, in my view, one of the triggers to change things around was this threat of it being listed under an annex of CITES, of this Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, because this would have very much limited the capacity to catch bluefin tuna on the high seas. And then I coincidentally met a couple of years later the delegate from Monaco who proposed it under CITES, Patrick van Klaveren, and he actually. And I said, well, what a pity, right, that it didn't work. And he said, well, actually, it woke up ICAT. So ICAT then was all of a sudden, wait a second, we might actually be losing our competence over our exclusive competence to manage these fisheries. We really need to do something now.
Yeah.
And considering that since... Yeah, and we've been fishing bluefin tuna since Aristotle, right? So he already wrote about bluefin tuna migration in the Mediterranean. So it goes back about 6,000 years. It's one of the longest fisheries that we know. The Phoenicians did it already in Cadiz, which is the oldest town in Europe. And since we started fishing, the stock has been reduced with 97%.
Yeah.
So
Crazy.
it couldn't get worse, right? That was also an advantage, if you want. It couldn't get worse. It could only get up, right? They hit
Yeah.
rock bottom, you might say. This is in my
Yeah.
words, right? Again, I'm not a natural scientist, but this is how I interpret it.
Yeah,
And that's when they
possibly
woke
doing
up.
even the slightest thing is gonna lead to an improvement, which
Yes,
then might give you back some credibility as the authority.
exactly.
Yeah.
That is what they did, in my view. Um, Reluctantly, but it worked. So it starts rebuilding the stock.
Yeah. Interesting, because I've also heard of ICAT in a very positive light. So I
Mhm.
guess it just kind of depends on what element of an RFMO or what they're supposed to manage you're talking about. And indeed, when it comes to the health of the stock, generally ICAT leaves some room for improvement.
It's a bit mean, of course, right, to focus on bluefin tuna because this is literally the worst example within ICAT's remit to focus on. There's other ways, like you said, where ICAT really has been a front runner in our
Yeah.
things, and there's other stock. There's so many other stocks they manage which do way better than bluefin tuna. So I'm glad you mentioned this because for any people who listen to this, don't think that ICAT is the worst of the
ICAT,
worst.
don't get mad at us.
Oh, because it's not true. So we're focusing
Yeah.
on bluefin tuna, where they
Yeah.
had done a bad job, and this is not my opinion, but this is also so these RFMOs get through a regular performance review, right? So our ICAT has been through two of them, one in 2008, which was really hammering it down that they did a really bad job. And another one in 2016, which could then look, okay, what has ICAT done since the last review? And there was a lot of things that they had done and a lot of things they had not done yet. So don't get mad at us, ICAT, indeed.
Yeah.
Bluefin tuna was not a good example up to 2010 or so, but then they started
Yeah.
rebuilding even that stock. So yes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the science doesn't lie also. Of
Mm-mm.
course, if you implement changes for the better, you're going to have to wait a few years before you see the positive change of that. But still, if you mismanage for a long time, yeah, that's going to reflect in the stock assessments and in the science, which, like you, I don't know that much about, but that is just the way it works, right? So yeah, as we mentioned, it's definitely not the only species under ICAT's management. It may be more high profile because of its commercial importance. There is also quite a complex stock structure with kind of the two populations,
Mhm. Yeah.
and there is a history of overfishing, as
Yeah.
I didn't know that exact figure, but 97% reduction of the initial population. That is quite shocking. And other species I know that are on the red list of sites have, I think it's 98%. So they're not that far off in possibly having made that list.
Yeah.
Diving into this a little bit further, what do you see as some of the main successes that we have seen and some of the weaknesses, specifically if you look at the management measures that ICAT has taken in, kind of the context of that bluefin tuna?
Well, you mentioned the science already, Eva. So that I think
Yeah.
that is a really crucial point, right? So to what extent do, and this is not just ICAT, this is in general RFMOs, to what extent do RFMOs rely on the science they get? And where do they get their science from?
Yeah.
Because this also differs per RFMO. So they have different organizations that deliver their science. And to what extent is that then taken up on? And I was just reading through the committee report over 2024-2025 from
Hmm.
ICAT's scientific committee. They also deal with, I think it's called the Scientific Research and Statistics Committee. And they admit that there's a lot of things where there's for some stocks, let me put it differently, for some stocks, they just don't know what the status of the stock is, right? Because, I mean, and this is my simple lawyer mind, who always thinks it's easy to count cows on a meadow, then you know how many there are. But that's a much more difficult thing to do in the ocean, right? Stock assessments
Obviously. Yeah. Yeah.
for high seas fisheries is a whole
Yeah.
other ballgame.
Just one thing that makes fisheries management and ocean governance so complex.
And this is also the crucial point where the precautionary approach comes in, right? Because if you somehow have this limit, okay, this is your maximum sustainable yield, which is not
Mm-hmm.
the best measure there is, according to scientists, but it's the one that is laid down in the Law of the Sea Convention. And there are better measures now. But the problem is also that often we see a maximum as a goal as such, right? So we don't see it as a maximum, but we see it as something that we then need to achieve. Okay, this is
Yeah,
the maximum.
exactly.
We're going to go all the way.
Yeah,
But
it's
if
kind of
you're
how the
not,
brain works,
yes,
almost.
and if you're not 100% sure that the limit is actually there because you don't know exactly how much fish there is, and then the precautionary approach, in my view, but it kind of creates a buffer. So it says stop short of this limit, right? Stop
Mm-hmm.
here, fish until here, because we don't know. We kind of need this uncertainty buffer. And there's all kind of technical features in an annex to the fish stocks agreement that tell you about how to do this. It's a bit too far to deal with that now, but it gives you that guideline. And I think that is a very important thing, that if you start implementing that, the reliance on the science, which has been done more and more by an organization like ICAT, right? So increasingly the reliance on science, that is very much an improvement. And when it comes to illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, normally abbreviated as IUU fishing, they have taken measures there as well. So creating lists of vessels that are allowed to fish in the area, the so-called white lists. They used to have black lists as well, right, in RFMOs. So black list where these vessels are not allowed to fish in the area, but then they can change their name and their registration easily. So it's easier to work with white lists, which is actually, these are the vessels who are actually allowed in so and so and so. And I think which is a very interesting approach as well, they have payback systems now. So
Okay.
certain members of ICAT who have fished too much in the past, this is not
Mm-hmm.
limited to bluefin tuna, right? This is valid to all kinds of stocks.
Any of the species, yeah.
Get a reduction for future quota.
Okay.
And there's recommendations under ICAT and resolutions who then lay down, or the recommendations, sorry, who then lay down the quota over the next couple of years. And this is what they
Mm-hmm.
call payback systems. So
Okay.
that is also an interesting improvement, I think, to see how you can do this. ICAT also had to deal with new members, right? So you only have so much fish. And the Law of the Sea Convention, as well as the Fish Stocks Agreement, kind of require you to join the responsible RFMO or stop fishing, right? So let's say, Eva, you are ICAT and I'm not a member yet. Then if I want to join, or if I want to continue fishing, I either have to become a member of your organization or stop
Mm-hmm.
fishing. But, and this is what Andrew Surdy has written a book about a couple of years ago, this is the new entrance problem. Because if I join your organization, the pie is not getting bigger, right? So it means that everybody has to fish a little less,
Mm-hmm.
assuming that the stock is of the same size. So this is also something that ICAT has been dealing with and had to deal with, how to do this. But this is just my simple assessment. It has been future looking to the future as well. So more and more you see how we're going to do this over a longer period of time and so on.
But can imagine, like, yeah, just quite complex, constantly having to address some of these challenges of the new reality, which I think in general, Law of the Sea is dealing with. And like something I focus on a lot as well is that sometimes now with these limitations that we have in fisheries transparency or fisheries management, they come very much from national law, but then you're dealing with international law of the sea, and you're dealing with these regional systems and management that are negotiated in the context of RFMO. So it's just such an inherently complex system where on paper we can shift a lot, but in the end, if you just look at the biology, there's just only so many fish in the sea. And that's just
Yes. Yeah.
so. With all of the work you've done, kind of zooming out on the, I guess, legal concept and more zooming in on you as a person in, your experience as a legal academic, doing a lot of research, but also having worked with different organizations and projects. What have been some pivotal experiences or lessons that have really fundamentally shaped how you think about fisheries management and kind of everything we've discussed so far?
I think that is something that I learned from my PhD supervisor. I agree with her that the world would look very different if we just implement the current international laws that are already there. So there's often a call for new laws, new treaties, new agreements, right? I wonder if that's always necessary. In certain places, that is definitely the case, right? There's gaps in the law, which we started our conversation with, and that makes it very interesting. But if we implement the rules that we already have, and if you, for example, look at maximum sustainable yield, which we mentioned before, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the parties to the Law of the Sea Convention, 170 in total, right, including the European Union, did not have maximum sustainable yield in their domestic legislation. And this is not even the
Mm-hmm.
best measure that we have, right? It's
Yeah.
suboptimal already, and even
Yeah.
that is not implemented.
Yeah.
So I think we have pretty good laws, to be honest. It's just the implementation very often in national legislation that is sometimes lacking. And that is not always the fault or the mistake of that very state who did not implement it. To give you an example from when I was working as a master's student at the FAO, my boss asked me to develop or to draft fisheries regulations for a West African state. And I looked in all kinds of things, being super naive, right? And went, oh, there's a Coast Guard vessel, and we have a helicopter, and we have this and that and that. And she came
Not
back to me.
considering the budget at all.
She said this state, I think, has 100. I don't pin me down on the number, but I think it was 150-kilometer long coastline. She said they
Oh
have
yeah.
one Coast Guard vessel whose engine is broken since 3 years. That's
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So this is not the fault of that state, right? Obviously not. But the capacity to enforce the rules that you then have, and that also relates to what you just mentioned before. ICAT doesn't have its own police. There's no way you find you fishing on the high seas and then all of a sudden the ICAT police passes by, because it's not existent. For the enforcement of these rules, ICAT is dependent on its member states. So even if ICAT has the most advanced rules there are, it's still dependent on its implementation by national states, or by states, sorry, to do this. And so I think, and you will hear this from a lot of international lawyers, but the thing is, implementation and enforcement is key, right? Also in fisheries law. What I find therefore very interesting is, for example, the Port State Measures Agreement, right? Because the Port State Measures Agreement is an idea where you say, okay, if you catch fish illegally, and this is in a nutshell, this is very much simplified, you need to bring it on land somewhere anyway, right? So if more and more port states prohibit you from landing this fish, at some point there's no place to go, and it doesn't make sense to catch this fish in the first place.
Or it becomes so expensive to go to a
Yes,
port where you're allowed to land it that it's no longer lucrative.
exactly. And I think
Yeah.
this is a very innovative idea, right?
Yeah.
It came from a Norwegian delegate, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 2000s, and it works. So I think these are very innovative ideas, and maybe we need more of those.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that kind of gap between, especially in at sea operations, between what is realistic enforcement and what are the laws on paper. Sometimes I feel like defending some of these things, it's like, yes, it makes you sound like a good person and it makes it sound like you're standing on the right side of history, but in the end, if it's practically not feasible, what are you really doing? So I do think just that sense of realism and also not judging states for not always being able to fully live up to these international obligations. As you said, I do agree, where very often, if we could even get to the point of whatever is in place now to actually see that in practice, that would already be such a significant improvement. And maybe it is also, especially because of these limitations at a national state level, not always the responsibility of international platforms to dictate exactly how it should look, because the economic realities of fisheries management are going to look very differently in different states, as well as just what they need is going to look very differently in the different states. So I think that's a very good example of, how a moment can really shape the way you look at things, even if you don't necessarily have the firsthand experience of working in that state in their fisheries management. And I think also when I started in the fisheries sector, I was very naive, which I find interesting to think about now, because I'm not a naive person, but really, really took me years and I'm sure there's still so many things that I still don't know and have to learn to really understand why it is so complex to talk about the management of fisheries and about sustainability of what's responsible management of the fisheries. And really thinking back of some of these ideas I had when I just started, now it just kind of makes me laugh like, oh, even though it's like 10 years ago, it's not even that long ago, but it's like, yeah, it's a hard reality with fisheries. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in recent years, we've seen both successes and maybe failures in internationally negotiated agreements for ocean conservation. You mentioned the Port State Measures Agreement, which I think is indeed an example of something that's generally celebrated as a success, also because of its practical feasibility and then the expected impacts that it has. How do you see the role of international law in advancing marine conservation going forward? You've touched upon it a little bit already. We're thinking that it is generally in quite a good place. But yeah, how do you think that, moving forward, it is going to play that role? And is there maybe anything in that context that you're like, oh, actually, that deserves more attention?
Yeah, so there's different ways to go about it, right? So it's many people think these days, for example, about marine protected areas. But
Uh-huh.
in my view, a marine protected area as such doesn't mean much. You always have to look at what is actually protected in that area. Because most marine protected areas are not akin to a national park where you have a fence and you pay an entrance fee and you don't even find a recycling bin in the park, right? So this is not how it works in the ocean, obviously. We cannot fence off places. There's many marine protected areas where fishing is, for example, still allowed. So I think these marine protected areas is something, and this is also the incentive, right? That's now there out in international law, to have them. And now with the BB&J agreement, also to have the possibility legally to have them on the high seas. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities that we focus very often on the international, but a lot of it can also be achieved regionally. So I think sometimes it's easier because regions tend to be a little bit more coherent. So we work a lot with the South Pacific here, for example, and that region is in some ways quite coherent, pushed, for example, for the Sustainable Development Goal on the oceans, right? So maybe don't only look at the international level, always try to achieve everything globally. No, there's regionally also a lot that we can achieve. Marine protected areas is one of extreme example of, I think, protection of the marine environment. But these incentives, trade-based incentives, I think are also important. And we mentioned two already, right? So this Port State Measures Agreement is in a way a trade-based idea because it says, okay, when you cannot land the fish, that's it. That should be the incentive not to fish in the first place. CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, which we talked about before in relation to the Atlantic bluefin tuna, is another one, right? This tries to limit the trade in endangered species in order to create an incentive for not to harvest these species in the first place because it's so difficult to actually trade them. There's so many barriers to trade. And I think these things could really work because many actual ideas for marine protection suffer very much from the lack of implementation and enforcement. And with trade, that might be easier to do because you then have customs officers in place. If you've been to an airport, you often see these animals you're not allowed to take in. That's all based on
Yeah,
CITES,
exactly.
right? So
Yeah.
I live in Australia now, as I said. This is one of the strictest countries with the most strict biosecurity rules in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at new ways of protecting these kind of things, I think that could be really helpful. And I think in a holistic perspective might also be becoming more and more important. This sounds a
Mm-hmm.
bit like, ooh, holistic, right? But it's the ecosystem approach, for example. I see that as an holistic approach. So you look at no longer single species.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't make any sense, right? Cod eats herring. So if you start regulating cod, you might as well regulate herring because, I mean, what are you going to do? So it's for me, as a non-natural scientist, as simple as that. But so I think this is also interesting. As I understand it, conservation of biological diversity has the add-on effect of also mitigating climate change, for example. So in this, you cannot say that generally, but it works. So this is also one of these holistic aspects that have not in depth been covered by, for example, RFMOs, but it happens. Oceans get warmer, fish stocks move, and then move to other exclusive economic zones, for example. Do you then all of a sudden have these rights? This happened between Scotland and Iceland, for example, right? A certain stock that had been in Scottish waters for centuries moved north. And the Scots followed it until they reached the exclusive economic zone of Iceland. And Iceland said, exclusive rights for us. And Scotland said, well, historic rights for us. Right. So this is something that we have to deal with in the future as well. So this, for me, this climate change aspect, which might have been covered now on the sidelines, is becoming more and more important as well. And let's see how international organizations are going to pick that up. And I think there's a role for, if not international law, then at least regional ideas to start covering that. Yeah. Of course, there's many more, but ideas. But I think this is one of the few that I would mention on the top of my head.
Yeah, amazing. I think definitely food for thought. And yeah, you do see all these amazing, I guess, more comprehensive and acknowledging the biological reality of these marine ecosystems, which I think for lawmakers and those involved with the international politics of fisheries management, there's a lot to think about there, and gives hope that we're going to continue to see improvement in responsible fisheries management. So thank you so much for speaking today, marking the first episode of Talking to My Fellow Fish Lawyer series. And I am sure our listeners learned a lot about the Convention on the Law of the Sea and its implementing agreements like the Fish Stock Agreement. And then, of course, the Principle of Common Heritage of Mankind and bluefin tuna. Next week, I will be speaking to a South African lawyer specializing in deep seabed mining. So we're not going to let go of the seabed and minerals and the principle of common heritage of mankind yet. So tune in for that one. And thanks again so much, Erik, for speaking with us today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.